St. Augustine's Confessions, Book 3. Confessions 1. I went to Carthage, where I found myself in the midst of a hissing cauldron of lust. I had not yet fallen in love, but I was in love with the idea of it, and this feeling that something was missing made me despise myself for not being more anxious to satisfy the need. I began to look around for some object for my love, since I badly wanted to love something. I had no liking for the safe path without pitfalls, for although my real need was for you, my God, who are the food of the soul, I was not aware of this hunger. I felt no need for the food that does not perish, not because I had had my fill of it, but because the more I was starved of it, the less palatable it seemed. Because of this, my soul fell sick. It broke out in ulcers and looked about desperately for some material, worldly means of relieving the itch which they caused. But material things which have no soul could not be true objects for my love. To love and to have my love returned was my heart's desire, and it would be all the sweeter if I could also enjoy the body of the one who loved me. So I muddied the stream of friendship with the filth of lewdness and clouded its clear waters with hell's black river of lust. And yet, in spite of this rank depravity, I was vain enough to have ambitions of cutting a fine figure in the world. I also fell in love, which was a snare of my own choosing. My God of mercy, how good you were to me, for you mixed much bitterness in that cup of pleasure. My love was returned and finally shackled me in the bonds of its consummation. In the midst of my joy, I was caught up in the coils of trouble, for I was lashed with the cruel fiery rods of jealousy and suspicion, fear, anger, and quarrels. Confessions 2. I was much attracted by the theatre, because the plays reflected my own unhappy plight and were tinder to my fire. Why is it that men enjoy feeling sad at the sight of tragedy and suffering on the stage, although they would be most unhappy if they had to endure the same fate themselves? Yet they watch the plays because they hope to be made to feel sad, and the feeling of sorrow is what they enjoy. What miserable delirium this is! The more a man is subject to such suffering himself, the more easily he is moved by it in the theatre. Yet when he suffers himself, we call it misery. When he suffers out of sympathy with others, we call it pity. But what sort of pity can we really feel for an imaginary scene on the stage? The audience is not called upon to offer help, but only to feel sorrow. And the more they are pained, the more they applaud the author. Whether this human agony is based on fact or is simply imaginary, if it is acted so badly that the audience is not moved to sorrow, they leave the theatre in a disgruntled and critical mood, whereas if they are made to feel pain, they stay to the end watching happily. This shows that sorrow and tears can be enjoyable. Of course, everyone wants to be happy, but even if no one likes being sad, is there just the one exception that, because we enjoy pitying others, we welcome their misfortunes, without which we could not pity them? If so, it is because friendly feelings well up in us like the waters of a spring. But what course do these waters follow? Where do they flow? Why do they trickle away to join the stream of boiling pitch, the hideous flood of lust? For by their own choice they lose themselves and become absorbed in it. They are diverted from their true course and deprived of their original heavenly calm. Of course, this does not mean that we must arm ourselves against compassion. There are times when we must welcome sorrow on behalf of others, but for the sake of our souls, we must beware of uncleanness. My God must be the keeper of my soul, the God of our fathers, who is to be exalted and extolled for evermore. My soul must guard against uncleanness. I am not nowadays insensible to pity, but in those days I used to share the joy of stage lovers and their sinful pleasure in each other, even though it was all done in make-believe for the sake of entertainment. And when they were parted, pity of a sort led me to share their grief. I enjoyed both these emotions equally, but now I feel more pity for a man who is happy in his sins than for one who has to endure the ordeal of foregoing some harmful pleasure or being deprived of some enjoyment which was really an affliction. Of the two, this sort of pity is certainly the more genuine, but the sorrow which it causes is not a source of pleasure. For although a man who is sorry for the sufferings of others deserves praise for his charity, nevertheless, if his pity is genuine, he would prefer that there should be no cause for his sorrow. If the impossible could happen and kindness were unkind, a man whose sense of pity was true and sincere might want others to suffer so that he could pity them. Sorrow may therefore be commendable, but never desirable. For it is powerless to stab you, Lord God, and this is why the love you bear for our souls and the compassion you show for them are pure and unalloyed, far purer than the love and pity which we feel ourselves. But who can prove himself worthy of such a calling? However, in those unhappy days I enjoyed the pangs of sorrow. I always looked for things to wring my heart, and the more tears an actor caused me to shed by his performance on the stage, even though he was portraying the imaginary distress of others, the more delightful and attractive I found it. Was it any wonder that I, the unhappy sheep who strayed from your flock, impatient of your shepherding, became infected with a loathsome mange? Hence my love of things which made me sad. I did not seek the kind of sorrow which would wound me deeply, for I had no wish to endure the sufferings which I saw on the stage. But I enjoyed fables and fictions which could only graze the skin. But where the fingers scratch, the skin becomes inflamed. It swells and festers with hideous pus. And the same happened to me. Could the life I led be called true life, my God? Confessions 3. Yet all the while, far above, your mercy hovered faithfully about me. I exhausted myself in depravity, in the pursuit of an unholy curiosity. I deserted you and sank to the bottommost depths of skepticism and the mockery of devil worship. My sins were a sacrifice to the devil, and for all of them you chastised me. I defied you even so far as to relish the thought of lust, and gratify it too, within the walls of your church during the celebration of your mysteries. For such a deed I deserved to pluck the fruit of death, and you punished me for it with a heavy lash. But compared with my guilt, the penalty was nothing. How infinite is your mercy, my God! You are my refuge from the terrible dangers amongst which I wandered, head on high, intent upon withdrawing still further from you. I loved my own way, not yours, but it was a truant's freedom that I loved. Besides these pursuits, I was also studying for the law. Such ambition was held to be honorable, and I determined to succeed in it. The more unscrupulous I was, the greater my reputation was likely to be, for men are so blind that they even take pride in their blindness. By now, I was at the top of the school of rhetoric. I was pleased with my superior status and swollen with conceit. All the same, as you well know, Lord, I behaved far more quietly than the wreckers, a title of ferocious devilry which the fashionable set chose for themselves. I had nothing whatever to do with their outbursts of violence, but I lived amongst them, feeling a perverse sense of shame, because I was not like them. I kept company with them, and there were times when I found their friendship a pleasure, but I always had a horror of what they did when they lived up to their name. Without provocation, they would set upon some timid newcomer, gratuitously affronting his sense of decency for their own amusement and using it as fodder for their spiteful jests. This was the devil's own behavior, or not far different. Wreckers was a fit name for them, for they were already adrift and total wrecks themselves. The mockery and trickery, which they loved to practice on others, was a secret snare of the devil, by which they were mocked and tricked themselves. Confessions 4. These were the companions with whom I studied the art of eloquence at that impressionable age. It was my ambition to be a good speaker, for the unhallowed and inane purpose of gratifying human vanity. The prescribed course of study brought me to a work by an author named Cicero, whose writing nearly everyone admires, if not the spirit of it. The title of the book is Hortensius, and it recommends the reader to study philosophy. It altered my outlook on life. It changed my prayers to you, O Lord, and provided me with new hopes and aspirations. All my empty dreams suddenly lost their charm, and my heart began to throb with a bewildering passion for the wisdom of eternal truth. I began to climb out of the depths to which I had sunk, in order to return to you, for I did not use the book as a whetstone to sharpen my tongue. It was not the style of it, but the contents which won me over, and yet the allowance which my mother paid me was supposed to be spent on putting an edge on my tongue. I was now in my 19th year, and she supported me, because my father had died 2 years before. My God, how I burned with longing to have wings to carry me back to you, away from all earthly things, although I had no idea what you would do with me. For yours is the wisdom. In Greek, the word philosophy means love of wisdom, and it was with this love that the Hortensius inflamed me. There are people for whom philosophy is a means of misleading others, for they misuse its great name, its attractions, and its integrity to give color and gloss to their own errors. Most of these so-called philosophers who lived in Cicero's time and before are noted in the book. He shows them up in their true colors and makes quite clear how wholesome is the admonition which the Holy Spirit gives in the words of your good and true servant Paul. Take care not to let anyone cheat you with his philosophizings, with empty fantasies drawn from human tradition, from worldly principles. They were never Christ's teaching. In Christ, the whole plenitude of deity is embodied and dwells in him. But, O light of my heart, you know that at that time, although Paul's words were not known to me, the only thing that pleased me in Cicero's book was his advice not simply to admire one another of the schools of philosophy, but to love wisdom itself, whatever it might be, and to search for it, pursue it, hold it, and embrace it firmly. These were the words which excited me and set me burning with fire, and the only check to this blaze of enthusiasm was that they made no mention of the name of Christ. For by your mercy, Lord, from the time when my mother fed me at the breast, my infant heart had been suckled dutifully on his name, the name of your Son, my Saviour. Deep inside my heart his name remained, and nothing could entirely captivate me, however learned, however neatly expressed, however true it might be, unless his name were in it. Confessions 5. So I made up my mind to examine the Holy Scriptures and see what kind of books they were. I discovered something that was at once beyond the understanding of the proud and hidden from the eyes of children. Its gate was humble, but the heights it reached were sublime. It was enfolded in mysteries, and I was not the kind of man to enter into it or bow my head to follow where it led. But these were not the feelings I had when I first read the Scriptures. To me they seemed quite unworthy of comparison with the stately prose of Cicero, because I had too much conceit to accept their simplicity and not enough insight to penetrate their depths. It is surely true that as the child grows, these books grow with him, but I was too proud to call myself a child. I was inflated with self-esteem, which made me think myself a great man. Confession 6. I fell in with a set of sensualists, men with glib tongues who ranted and raved and had the snares of the devil in their mouths. They baited the traps by confusing the syllables of the names of God the Father, God the Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, and God the Holy Ghost, the Paraclete who comforts us. These names were always on the tips of their tongues, but only as sounds which they mouthed aloud, for in their hearts they had no inkling of the truth. Yet truth, and truth alone, was the motto which they repeated to me again and again, although the truth was nowhere to be found in them. All that they said was false, both what they said about you, who truly are the truth, and what they said about this world and its first principles, which were your creation. But I ought not to have been content with what the philosophers said about such things, even when they spoke the truth. I should have passed beyond them for love of you, my supreme Father, my good Father, in whom all beauty has its source. Truth, truth, how the very marrow of my soul within me yearned for it as they dinned it in my ears over and over again. To them it was no more than a name to be voiced or a word to be read in their libraries of huge books. But while my hunger was for you, for truth itself, these were the dishes on which they served me up the sun and the moon, beautiful works of yours, but still only your works, not you yourself, nor even the greatest of your created things. For your spiritual works are greater than these material things, however brightly they may shine in the sky. But my hunger and thirst were not even for the greatest of your works, but for you, my God, because you are truth itself, with whom there can be no change, no swerving from your course. Yet the dishes they set before me were still loaded with dazzling fantasies, illusions with which the eye deceives the mind. It would have been better to love the sun itself, which at least is real as far as we can see. But I gulped down this food because I thought it was you. I had no relish for it, because the taste it left in my mouth was not the taste of truth. It could not be, for it was not you, but an empty sham. And it did not nourish me, but starved me all the more. The food we dream of is very like the food we eat when we are awake, but it does not nourish because it is only a dream. Yet the things they gave me to eat were not in the least like you, as now I know since you have spoken to me. They were dream substances, mock realities, far less true than the real things which we see with the sight of our eyes in the sky or on the earth. These things are seen by bird and beast as well as by ourselves, and they are far more certain than any image we conceive of them. And in turn we can picture them to ourselves with greater certainty than the vaster, infinite things which we surmise from them. Such things have no existence at all, but they were the visionary foods on which I was then fed, but not sustained. But you, O God, whom I love and on whom I lean in weakness so that I may be strong, you are not the sun and the moon and the stars, even though we see these bodies in the heavens. Nor are you those other bodies which we do not see in the sky, for you created them, and in your reckoning they are not even among the greatest of your works. How far then must you really be from those fantasies of mine, those imaginary material things which do not exist at all? The images we form in our mind's eye when we picture things that really do exist are far better founded than these inventions, and the things themselves are still more certain than the images we form of them. But you are not these things. Neither are you the soul, which is the life of bodies, and since it gives them life must be better and more certain than they are themselves. But you are the life of souls, the life of lives. You live, O life of my soul, because you are life itself, immutable. Where were you in those days? How far away from me? I was wandering far from you, and I was not even allowed to eat the husks on which I fed the swine. For surely the fables of the poets and the penmen are better than the traps which those impostors set. There is certainly more to be gained from verses and poems and tales like the flight of Medea than from their stories of the 5 elements disguised in various ways because of the 5 dens of darkness. These things simply do not exist, and they are death to those who believe in them. Verses and poems can provide real food for thought, but although I used to recite verses about Medea's flight through the air, I never maintained that they were true. And I never believed the poems which I heard others recite, but I did believe the tales which these men told. These were the stages of my pitiful fall into the depths of hell as I struggled and strained for lack of the truth. My God, you had mercy on me even before I had confessed to you. But I now confess that all this was because I tried to find you, not through the understanding of the mind by which you meant us to be superior to the beasts, but through the senses of the flesh. Yet you were deeper than my inmost understanding and higher than the topmost height that I could reach. I had blundered upon that woman in Solomon's parable who, ignorant and unabashed, sat at her door and said, "Stolen waters are sweetest, and bread is better eating when there is none to see." She inveigled me because she found me living in the outer world that lay before my eyes, the eyes of the flesh, and dwelling upon the food which they provided for my mind. Confession 7. There is another reality besides this, though I knew nothing of it. My own specious reasoning induced me to give in to the sly arguments of fools who asked me what was the origin of evil, whether God was confined to the limits of a bodily shape, whether he had hair and nails, and whether men could be called just if they had more than one wife at the same time, or killed other men, or sacrificed living animals. My ignorance was so great that these questions troubled me, and while I thought I was approaching the truth, I was only departing the further from it. I did not know that evil is nothing but the removal of good, until finally no good remains. How could I see this, when with the sight of my eyes I saw no more than material things, and with the sight of my mind no more than their images? I did not know that God is a spirit, a being without bulk and without limbs defined in length and breadth. For bulk is less in the part than in the whole, and if it is infinite, it is less in any part of it which can be defined within fixed limits than it is in its infinity. It cannot, therefore, be everywhere entirely whole, as a spirit is and as God is. Nor had I the least notion what is in us that gives us our being, or what the scriptures mean when they say that we are made in God's image. I knew nothing of the true underlying justice which judges, not according to convention, but according to the truly equitable law of Almighty God. This is the law by which each age and place forms rules of conduct best suited to itself, although the law itself is always and everywhere the same and does not differ from place to place or from age to age. I did not see that by the sanction of this law, Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and the others whom God praised were just men, although they have been reckoned sinners by men who are not qualified to judge, for they try them by human standards and assess all the rights and wrongs of the human race by the measure of their own customs. Anyone who does this behaves like a man who knows nothing about armor and cannot tell which piece is meant for which part of the body, so that he tries to cover his head with a shin piece and fix a helmet on his foot, and then complains because they will not fit. Or like a shopkeeper who is allowed to sell his wares in the morning, but grumbles because the afternoon is a public holiday and he is not allowed to trade. Or like a man who sees one of the servants in a house handling things which the cellar man is not allowed to touch, or finds something being done in the stable yard which is not allowed in the dining room, and is then indignant because the members of the household living together in one house are not all given the same privileges in all parts of the house. The people of whom I am speaking have the same sort of grievance when they hear that things which good men could do without sin in days gone by are not permitted in ours, and that God gave them one commandment and has given us another. He has done this because the times have demanded it, although men were subject to the same justice in those days as we are in these. Yet those who complain about this understand that when we are dealing with a single man, a single day, or a single house, each part of the whole has a different function suited to it. What may be done at one time of day is not allowed at the next, and what may be done, or must be done, in one room is forbidden and punished in another. This does not mean that justice is erratic or variable, but that the times over which it presides are not always the same, for it is the nature of time to change. Man's life on earth is short, and he cannot, by his own perception, see the connection between the conditions of earlier times and of other nations which he has not experienced himself, and those of his own times which are familiar to him. But when only one individual, one day, or one house is concerned, he can easily see what is suitable for each part of the whole, and for each member of the household, and what must be done at which times and places. These things he accepts, but with the habits of other ages he finds fault. I knew nothing of this at that time. I was quite unconscious of it, quite blind to it, although it stared me in the face. When I composed verses, I could not fit any foot in any position that I pleased. Each meter was differently scanned, and I could not put the same foot in every position in the same line. And yet the art of poetry by which I composed does not vary from one line to another. It is the same for all alike. But I did not discern that justice, which those good and holy men obeyed, in a far more perfect and sublime way than poetry contains in itself at one and the same time all the principles which it prescribes without discrepancy. Although, as times change, it prescribes and apportions them, not all at once, but according to the needs of the times. Blind to this, I found fault with the holy patriarchs, not only because in their own day they acted as God commanded and inspired them, but also because they predicted the future as he revealed it to them. Confessions 8. Surely it is never wrong, at any time or in any place, for a man to love God with his whole heart, and his whole soul, and his whole mind, and to love his neighbor as himself. Sins against nature, therefore, like the sin of Sodom, are abominable and deserve punishment wherever and whenever they are committed. If all nations committed them, all alike would be held guilty of the same charge in God's law. For our Maker did not prescribe that we should use each other in this way. In fact, the relationship which we ought to have with God is itself violated when our nature, of which he is the author, is desecrated by perverted lust. On the other hand, offences against human codes of conduct vary according to differences of custom, so that no one, whether he is a native or a foreigner, may, to suit his own pleasure, violate the conventions established by the customary usage or the law of the community or the state. For any part that is out of keeping with the whole is at fault. But if God commands a nation to do something contrary to its customs or constitutions, it must be done, even if it has never been done in that country before. If it is a practice which has been discontinued, it must be resumed. And if it was not a law before, it must be enacted. In his own kingdom, a king has the right to make orders which neither he nor any other has ever made before. Obedience to his orders is not against the common interest of the community. In fact, if they were disobeyed, the common interest would suffer, because it is the general agreement in human communities that the ruler is obeyed. How much more right, then, has God to give commands, since he is the ruler of all creation and all his creatures must obey his commandments without demur? For all must yield to God, just as in the government of human society, the lesser authority must yield to the greater. With sins of violence, the case is the same as with sins against nature. Here the impulse is to injure others, either by word or by deed, but by whichever means it is done, there are various reasons for doing it. A man may injure his enemy for the sake of revenge. A robber may assault a traveler to secure for himself something that is not his own. Or a man may attack someone whom he fears in order to avoid danger to himself. Or the injury may be done from envy, which will cause an unhappy man to harm another more fortunate than himself, or a rich man to harm someone whose rivalry he fears for the future or already resents. Again, it may be done for the sheer joy of seeing others suffer, as is the case with those who watch gladiators or make fun of other people and jeer at them. These are the main categories of sin. They are hatched from the lust for power, from gratification of the eye, and from gratification of corrupt nature. From one or two of these, or from all three together. Because of them, O God most high, most sweet, our lives offend against your 10-stringed harp, your commandments, the 3 which proclaim our duty to you, and the 7 which proclaim our duty to men. But how can sins of vice be against you, since you cannot be marred by perversion? How can sins of violence be against you, since nothing can injure you? Your punishments are for the sins which men commit against themselves, because although they sin against you, they do wrong to their own souls, and their malice is self-betrayed. They corrupt and pervert their own nature, which you made and for which you shaped the rules, either by making wrong use of the things which you allow, or by becoming inflamed with passion to make unnatural use of things which you do not allow. Or else their guilt consists in raving against you in their hearts and with their tongues, and kicking against the goad. Or in playing havoc with the restrictions of human society, and brazenly exulting in private feuds and factions, each according to his fancies or his fads. This is what happens, O Fountain of Life, when we abandon you, who are the one true Creator of all that ever was or is, and each of us proudly sets his heart on some one part of your creation instead of on the whole. So it is by the path of meekness and devotion that we must return to you. You rid us of our evil habits and forgive our sins when we confess to you. You listen to the groans of the prisoners and free us from the chains which we have forged for ourselves. This you do for us unless we toss our heads against you in the illusion of liberty and in our greed for gain, at the risk of losing all, love our own good better than you yourself, who are the common good of all. Confessions 9. Among these vices and crimes and all the endless ways in which men do wrong, there are also the sins of those who follow the right path but go astray. By the rule of perfection, these lapses are condemned if we judge them aright, But the sinners may yet be praised, for they give promise of better fruit to come, like the young shoots which later bear the ears of corn. Sometimes we also do things which have every appearance of being sins against nature or against our fellow men, but are not sins because they offend neither you, the Lord our God, nor the community in which we live. For example, a man may amass a store of goods to meet the needs of life or some contingency, but it does not necessarily follow that he is a miser. Or he may be punished by those whose duty it is to correct misdemeanors, but it is by no means certain that they do it out of wanton cruelty. Many of the things we do may therefore seem wrong to men, but are approved in the light of your knowledge, and many which men applaud are condemned in your eyes. This is because the appearance of what we do is often different from the intention with which we do it, and the circumstances at the time may not be clear. But when you suddenly command us to do something strange and unforeseen, even if you had previously forbidden it, none can doubt that the command must be obeyed, even though for the time being you may conceal the reason for it, and it may conflict with the established rule of custom in some forms of society. For no society is right and good unless it obeys you. But happy are they who know that the commandment was yours. For all that your servants do is done as an example of what is needed for the present, or as a sign of what is yet to come. Confessions 10. I was ignorant of this and derided those holy servants and prophets of yours. But all that I achieved by deriding them was to earn your derision for myself, for I was gradually led to believe such nonsense as that a fig wept when it was plucked, and that the tree which bore it shed tears of mother's milk. But if some sanctified member of the sect were to eat the fig, someone else, of course, would have committed the sin of plucking it. He would digest it and breathe it out again in the form of angels or even as particles of God, retching them up as he groaned in prayer. These particles of the true and supreme God were supposed to be imprisoned in the fruit and could only be released by means of the stomach and teeth of one of the elect. I was foolish enough to believe that we should show more kindness to the fruits of the earth than to mankind for whose use they were intended. If a starving man, not a Manichae, were to beg for a mouthful, they thought it a crime worthy of mortal punishment to give him one. Confessions 11. But you sent down your help from above and rescued my soul from the depths of this darkness, because my mother, your faithful servant, wept to you for me, shedding more tears for my spiritual death than other mothers shed for the bodily death of a son. For in her faith and in the spirit which she had from you, she looked on me as dead. You heard her and did not despise the tears which streamed down, and watered the earth in every place where she bowed her head in prayer. You heard her, for how else can I explain the dream with which you consoled her, so that she agreed to live with me and eat at the same table in our home? Lately she had refused to do this because she loathed and shunned the blasphemy of my false beliefs. She dreamed that she was standing on a wooden rule, and coming towards her in a halo of splendor, she saw a young man who smiled at her in joy, although she herself was sad and quite consumed with grief. He asked her the reason for her sorrow and her daily tears, not because he did not know, but because he had something to tell her, for this is what happens in visions. When she replied that her tears were for the soul I had lost, he told her to take heart, for if she looked carefully, she would see that where she was, there also was I. And when she looked, she saw me standing beside her on the same rule. Where could this dream have come from, unless it was that you listened to the prayer of her heart? For your goodness is almighty. You take good care of each of us, as if you had no others in your care. and you look after all as you look after each. And surely it was for the same reason that when she told me of the dream and I tried to interpret it as a message, that she need not despair of being one day such as I was then, she said at once and without hesitation, "No, he did not say where he is you are, but where you are he is." I have often said before, and to the best of my memory I now declare to you, Lord, that I was much moved by this answer, which you gave me through my mother. She was not disturbed by my interpretation of her dream, plausible though it was, but quickly saw the true meaning, which I had not seen until she spoke. I was more deeply moved by this than by the dream itself, in which the joy for which this devout woman had still so long to wait was foretold so long before to comfort her in the time of her distress. For nearly 9 years were yet to come, during which I wallowed deep in the mire and the darkness of delusion. Often I tried to lift myself, only to plunge the deeper. Yet all the time this chaste, devout and prudent woman, a widow such as is close to your heart, never ceased to pray at all hours and to offer you the tears she shed for me. The dream had given new spirit to her hope, but she gave no rest to her sighs and her tears. Her prayers reached your presence, and yet you still left me to twist and turn in the dark. Confessions 12. I remember that in the meantime you gave her another answer to her prayers, though there is much besides this that escapes my memory, and much too that I must omit, because I am in haste to pass on to other things which I am more anxious to confess to you. This other answer you gave her through the mouth of one of your priests, a bishop who had lived his life in the church and was well versed in the scriptures. My mother asked him, as a favor, to have a talk with me, so that he might refute my errors, drive the evil out of my mind, and replace it with good. He often did this when he found suitable pupils, but he refused to do it for me. A wise decision, as I afterwards realized. He told her that I was still unripe for instruction because, as she had told him, I was brimming over with the novelty of the heresy and had already upset a great many simple people with my casuistry. "Leave him alone," he said. "Just pray to God for him. From his own reading he will discover his mistakes and the depth of his profanity." At the same time he told her that when he was a child his misguided mother had handed him over to the Manichees. He had not only read almost all their books, but had also made copies of them, and even though no one argued the case with him or put him right, he had seen for himself that he ought to have nothing to do with the sect, and accordingly he had left it. Even after she had heard this, my mother still would not be pacified, but persisted all the more with her tears and her entreaties that he should see me and discuss the matter. At last he grew impatient and said, "Leave me and go in peace. It cannot be that the son of these tears should be lost." In later years, as we talked together, she used to say that she accepted these words as a message from heaven.